In the spring of 1887, a traveling photographer named Edmund Grayson arrived in the coal mining town of Harlan, Kentucky, carrying his equipment through muddy streets lined with timber frame houses that seemed to lean toward one another like exhausted workers. Harlan was a place where the mountains closed in so tight that sunlight reached the valley floor for only a few hours each day, leaving the town in a perpetual state of twilight that made every shadow longer than it should have been. Grayson had been commissioned by the Harlan Coal Company to document the living conditions of their workers, a public relations effort designed to counter rumors of exploitation that had begun circulating in newspapers across the eastern states. What he captured instead would become one of the most disturbing photographic records in American history. On May 14, 1887, Grayson set up his camera outside a small cabin on the eastern edge of town, where the forest began to reclaim the cleared land with aggressive persistence. The cabin belonged to the Pritchard family, miners who had worked the coal seams for 3 generations, their lungs blackened by dust, their hands scarred by the sharp edges of anthracite. Standing before his lens were 5 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14 years old: Thomas, Mary, James, Elizabeth, and little Sarah. They wore their Sunday clothes, freshly washed despite the perpetual coal dust that settled on everything in Harlan. Their hair was combed, their faces were clean, and they were smiling. The photograph itself appeared unremarkable at first glance. 5 children arranged in descending height, the oldest boy's hand resting protectively on his youngest sister's shoulder, all of them staring directly into the camera with expressions that seemed almost rehearsed in their cheerfulness. Grayson noted in his journal that evening that the Pritchard children had been unusually cooperative and pleasant, a stark contrast to the general atmosphere of melancholy that pervades this God-forsaken valley. But there was something in that image, something that would only become apparent years later when historians and researchers began examining the photographic archives of Appalachian coal towns with forensic attention. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. We preserve the stories that history tried to bury, bringing light to the darkest corners of America's past, one forgotten truth at a time. The photograph was filed away with hundreds of others Grayson took during his 3-week stay in Harlan, eventually donated to the Kentucky Historical Society in 1923, 2 years after his death. For decades, it remained in storage, occasionally viewed by researchers studying labor conditions in the late 19th century, but never examined with any particular scrutiny. The Pritchard children were just another set of faces among thousands, anonymous representatives of a forgotten working class. In 1978, a graduate student named Catherine Merrill was conducting research for her dissertation on child labor in Appalachian mining communities when she came across Grayson's collection. She spent weeks photographing the images for her research, using newly available photocopying technology to create detailed reproductions. It was during this process, while examining a high-contrast copy of the Pritchard family photograph under magnification, that she noticed something impossible. The children's shadows fell in different directions. Thomas, the eldest, cast his shadow to the left. Mary's fell almost directly behind her. James had no visible shadow at all. Elizabeth's shadow pointed right, and Sarah's seemed to split in 2 directions simultaneously, as if the light source itself couldn't decide where it was positioned. Merrill initially dismissed this as a photographic anomaly, perhaps the result of multiple exposures or the peculiar light conditions in the mountain valley. But the more she examined the image, the more inconsistencies emerged. The children's eyes, when magnified, appeared to reflect light from different sources. The texture of their clothing seemed to shift between exposures of the same negative. And there was something about their expressions, those carefully arranged smiles, that began to seem less like happiness and more like performance. She decided to research the Pritchard family directly, searching for census records, birth certificates, and any documentation that might provide context for the photograph. What she found in the Harlan County archives would transform her dissertation into something far darker than a study of labor practices. The Pritchard family did exist. Robert Pritchard, the father, had been employed by the Harlan Coal Company since 1879. His wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth in 1885, delivering a stillborn son. According to the company's employment records, Robert had 5 children: Thomas, Mary, James, Elizabeth, and Sarah. But according to the Harlan County Birth and Death Registry, meticulously maintained by the local church, only 3 of those children had ever been born alive. Thomas Pritchard was born January 3, 1873. Mary Pritchard was born March 19, 1875. Sarah Pritchard was born October 12, 1881. There were no records of James or Elizabeth ever existing, no birth certificates, no baptismal records, no mention in any official document prior to 1887. Yet there they stood in the photograph, as solid and real as their siblings, smiling at the camera with the same expression worn by the others. Merrill expanded her search, looking for any explanation. She examined school enrollment records and found that Thomas, Mary, and Sarah had attended the Harlan Primary School between 1879 and 1886. The teacher's notes described them as quiet, obedient children who rarely spoke unless directly addressed. There was no mention of James or Elizabeth ever attending school. She searched for medical records and found that Dr. Harrison Webb, the company physician, had treated Thomas for a broken arm in 1884 and Sarah for scarlet fever in 1886. Mary had been examined for persistent coughing in 1885, likely the early stages of the lung disease that would eventually claim many Harlan residents. Again, no mention of James or Elizabeth receiving any medical care whatsoever. The children who should not have existed were visible only in that single photograph and in the occasional mention in Robert Pritchard's employment file, where he had requested additional food rations to feed his 5 children, a request that was granted without question. Merrill traveled to Harlan in the summer of 1979, hoping to find descendants of the Pritchard family or anyone who might remember stories passed down through generations. What she discovered was a town that had been largely abandoned after the coal mines closed in 1963, its population scattered across Kentucky and neighboring states, its history gradually being reclaimed by the forest that had always waited at the edges of civilization. The Pritchard cabin no longer existed, burned down in a fire of unknown origin in 1891, just 4 years after the photograph was taken. The land had been purchased by the coal company, stripped for minerals and then left to erode into the hollows below. But Merrill did find one person who remembered the stories, a woman named Ruth Hensley, 84 years old, whose grandmother had lived 3 houses away from the Pritchards in the 1880s. Ruth's grandmother, Alice Monroe, had told stories about the Pritchard family that were passed down as cautionary tales, warnings about the things that could happen when grief went too deep into a person's heart. According to these stories, Robert Pritchard had never recovered from the death of his wife, Margaret. He worked the mines during the day and spent his evenings sitting in the cabin, talking to people who weren't there, setting places at the table for children who had never drawn breath. The miners, superstitious by nature and accustomed to the strange sounds and movements in the deep tunnels where they spent their days, had learned not to question what happened in other people's homes. If Robert Pritchard wanted to believe he had 5 children instead of 3, that was his grief to carry. The town accommodated his delusion without comment, the way communities sometimes do when confronted with a sorrow too profound to acknowledge directly. But Alice Monroe had seen something that troubled her until the day she died. One evening in late April 1887, just weeks before Grayson arrived with his camera, Alice had been walking past the Pritchard cabin when she heard children's laughter coming from inside. Not 3 voices, but 5. Distinct, separate, impossibly real. She had stopped, frozen on the path, listening to a sound that should not have existed. And then, through the window, she saw them. 5 silhouettes moving in the lamplight. 5 shadows cast against the thin curtains. 5 children playing a game that required them to hold hands in a circle. She never spoke to Robert Pritchard again. And when Edmund Grayson came to town with his camera, asking to photograph the local families, Alice had warned him not to go to the Pritchard cabin. But Grayson, a rational man from Philadelphia who did not believe in mountain superstitions, had gone anyway. The photograph he took should have been impossible. Yet there it existed, filed in an archive, reproduced in Merrill's dissertation, eventually digitized and available for anyone to examine. 5 children who smiled at the camera, 3 of whom had been born, 2 of whom had no explanation for their existence, except in the desperate imagination of a grieving father who loved them into a form of presence that even light itself could not fully deny. Catherine Merrill's dissertation, titled Visible Absences, Photography and Grief in Appalachian Mining Communities, was submitted to the University of Kentucky in December 1980. It was rejected by her committee with a recommendation that she revise her conclusions to focus on documentary evidence rather than what they termed speculative folklore. The photograph of the Pritchard children was dismissed as either a double exposure or a deliberate fabrication, though no technical analysis was conducted to support this conclusion. Merrill, discouraged but not defeated, filed her research in her personal archives and moved on to other projects. The photograph returned to obscurity. But obscurity in the age of information is never permanent. In 2003, during a digitization project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Kentucky Historical Society began uploading thousands of historical photographs to an online database accessible to researchers worldwide. The Pritchard family photograph was included in this collection, cataloged under Harlan County, Kentucky, 1887, Grayson Collection, Coal Mining Families. A forensic photographer named David Chen, working for a private firm specializing in historical image analysis, came across the photograph while researching 19th century photographic techniques for a book he was writing on the evolution of portraiture. Chen had spent 15 years examining photographs for authenticity, helping museums identify forgeries, and consulting on legal cases where historical images were disputed. He had developed a reputation for being able to detect manipulation that even modern technology sometimes missed. When he saw the Pritchard photograph, his first thought was that it was an obvious composite, multiple exposures layered together to create the illusion of 5 children where fewer actually existed. But when he subjected the image to spectral analysis, examining the light wavelengths captured in the original glass plate negative, he found something that contradicted every assumption he had made. The photograph was a single exposure, taken in natural light, with no evidence of manipulation or alteration. The inconsistent shadows, the strange reflections in the children's eyes, the subtle variations in focus that suggested they weren't all standing at the same distance from the camera, despite appearing to be in a single row, all of these anomalies existed in the original negative, not added later through darkroom techniques. Chen published his findings in the Journal of Photographic Science in 2005. In an article titled Optical Inconsistencies in 19th Century Portrait Photography, The Harlan Anomaly. His conclusion was carefully worded. The photograph represented either an unprecedented failure of optical physics or evidence of a phenomenon that current scientific understanding could not adequately explain. The article attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Parapsychologists seized on it as proof of spiritual manifestation. Skeptics argued that Chen had simply failed to identify the manipulation technique. And historians, intrigued by the mystery, began digging deeper into the story of the Pritchard family, hoping to find a rational explanation buried in the fragmentary records of a long-dead coal town. What they found instead was a pattern. Robert Pritchard had not been the only resident of Harlan, Kentucky, who claimed to have more children than official records could confirm. Between 1875 and 1895, at least 11 families in Harlan County had requested additional food rations, housing allowances, or medical care for children whose births were never registered, whose deaths were never recorded, and whose existence was acknowledged by the community but never questioned. The coal company's records, preserved in the archives of the Harlan County Historical Museum, showed these discrepancies clearly. Families of 3 claiming to be families of 5, couples with no documented children receiving education vouchers for 2, a widow who died in 1893, leaving behind 4 orphaned daughters according to her death certificate, though the church registry showed she had given birth only twice, both children dying in infancy. Dr. Ikoram Harrison Webb, the company physician who served Harlan from 1877 until his death in 1901, had kept detailed medical journals that were donated to the University of Kentucky Medical Archive in 1947. In these journals, he documented cases that troubled him, patients whose conditions defied his understanding of physiology and disease. Among these entries was a note dated June 2, 1888. Examined the Pritchard children today at the request of the school board, who received complaints from other parents about the strange behavior of the younger 2. I found Thomas, Mary, and Sarah to be in reasonable health given the conditions in which they live. The other 2 children, James and Elizabeth, presented no physical abnormalities that I could detect. though I confess I felt a profound unease in their presence. Their pulse rates were normal, their reflexes were appropriate, their responses to questions were coherent, yet I cannot escape the sensation that I was examining something that existed at the periphery of life rather than at its center. I advised the father to keep them home from school to avoid further disturbance, though I suspect the disturbance originates not from the children, but from our inability to reconcile what we see with what we know to be possible. Webb never mentioned the case again in his journals, but he did note in an entry dated November 1891 that Robert Pritchard had died in a mining accident, crushed by a ceiling collapse in Tunnel 7. The 3 surviving children, Thomas, Mary, and Sarah, were sent to live with relatives in Virginia. There was no mention of what happened to James and Elizabeth. The historical researchers who uncovered these documents in 2006 began calling the phenomenon the Harlan Manifestations, though they were careful not to endorse any supernatural explanation. What they proposed instead was a psychological theory that the extreme grief, isolation, and trauma experienced by families in coal mining communities during the late 19th century had created conditions for collective delusion, a shared hallucination so powerful that it left physical traces in photographs, medical records, and official documents. This theory was supported by similar cases found in other mining communities across Appalachia. In West Virginia, a town called Thurmond showed comparable discrepancies between birth records and household census data between 1880 and 1900. In Pennsylvania, the mining town of Centralia, later abandoned due to an underground coal fire, had reports of shadow children who appeared in family photographs but were never enrolled in school. In Tennessee, a village called Wilder had a cemetery with graves marked for children whose births were never officially registered. The pattern suggested something systemic, a response to conditions that pushed human psychology beyond its normal boundaries. These were communities where child mortality rates exceeded 50%, where entire families could be wiped out by mine collapses, gas explosions, or disease in a matter of hours, where the line between the living and the dead became thin enough to pass through without conscious effort. But this psychological explanation, however compelling, could not account for the photograph. In 2008, a team from MIT's Media Lab, specializing in computational photography and image forensics, was granted access to the original glass plate negative of the Pritchard family photograph. Using technology unavailable to previous researchers, they conducted a comprehensive analysis that measured every aspect of the image: light diffusion patterns, grain structure, chemical composition of the photographic emulsion, even microscopic scratches on the glass that might indicate tampering. Their findings, published in the Proceedings of Computational Photography Research in 2009, were unequivocal. The photograph was authentic. It was a single exposure, taken with the equipment Edmund Grayson was known to use, processed using chemicals consistent with 1887 photographic standards, and showing no evidence of manipulation, composite layering, or post-production alteration of any kind. The inconsistent shadows were real. The impossible reflections were real. The 5 children who should not have been able to stand together in a single moment of captured light were there, preserved in silver halide crystals, defying every law of optics and physics that governed the medium itself. The lead researcher, Dr. Elena Vasquez, concluded her report with a statement that would be quoted in dozens of subsequent articles and documentaries. "We can confirm what the photograph is. We cannot explain what it shows." The question that haunted everyone who studied the Pritchard photograph was not whether James and Elizabeth existed. The evidence suggested they had been seen, acknowledged, and documented by multiple witnesses, but rather what they were. If they were not children born in the conventional sense, if their presence violated the recorded facts of birth and death that defined human existence, then they represented something that occupied a space between hallucination and reality, between grief and manifestation, between what the mind created and what the world allowed to become visible. In 2011, a neurologist named Dr. Michael Reeves, specializing in the study of collective trauma and its psychological effects, proposed a theory that attempted to bridge the gap between rational explanation and documented anomaly. His paper, Psychogenic Materialization in High-Stress Communities, a Hypothesis, suggested that under conditions of extreme and sustained grief, the human mind could generate perceptual fields so powerful that they influenced physical reality in measurable ways. Reeves based his hypothesis on documented cases of mass hysteria, shared hallucinations, and environmental responses to collective emotional states. He cited examples from war zones, where entire units of soldiers reported seeing fallen comrades moving among them, their presence so convincing that officers included them in head counts and meal distributions. He referenced cases from prisons, where isolation and despair had created phantom presences that appeared on security cameras, their forms visible to multiple guards simultaneously. He pointed to research on quantum observation, the strange reality that particles behave differently when observed, suggesting that consciousness itself might play a role in determining what becomes physically real. According to Reeves, the coal mining communities of Appalachia in the late 19th century represented an extreme case of collective trauma. Parents watched children die from preventable diseases, from malnutrition, from accidents in the mines where even young boys were sent to work. The grief was constant, accumulating across generations, creating an emotional atmosphere so dense that it began to take form. The shadow children were not ghosts in the traditional sense, but rather projections of desperate longing, manifestations of love so powerful that they forced themselves into existence through sheer emotional intensity. This theory, while controversial, offered an explanation that was neither purely supernatural nor entirely dismissive. It suggested that the Pritchard photograph had captured something real, but something that existed in a state between thought and matter, between wish and substance. What do you believe? Could grief become so powerful that it rewrites reality itself, bringing into existence what should remain only in memory? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, do you think love can be stronger than the laws of nature? The theory gained support from an unexpected source. In 2013, researchers at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, a department dedicated to investigating phenomena that challenge conventional scientific understanding, began examining cases of attachment manifestations, situations where emotional bonds appeared to create observable physical effects. They documented cases of widows who reported seeing their deceased husbands so vividly that neighbors confirmed the sightings, of parents whose grief over lost children created presences that could be recorded on audio equipment, of communities where collective mourning generated phenomena that persisted for decades after the original loss. The researchers traveled to what remained of Harlan, Kentucky in 2014, hoping to find residual evidence of the manifestations that had occurred over a century earlier. What they found was a landscape transformed almost beyond recognition. The coal mines had closed in 1963, the town's population had declined from over 5,000 to fewer than 200, and the forests had reclaimed most of the valley. The Pritchard cabin was long gone, its location unmarked and forgotten. But they did find something unexpected. A small cemetery on the eastern slope of the mountain, overgrown and unmaintained, where several graves bore markers for children who did not appear in birth records. One of these graves, covered in moss and nearly illegible, had been placed sometime in the early 1890s. The inscription read, "James and Elizabeth Pritchard, beloved children, forever in our hearts." The grave had no death date, no birth date, just names and that single line of mourning. The researchers used ground-penetrating radar to examine the site, expecting to find either an empty plot or perhaps the remains of small animals or objects buried in symbolic memorial. What the radar revealed was far stranger. The soil density beneath the marker was inconsistent with undisturbed earth, suggesting that something had been buried there, but the pattern of disturbance did not match any conventional burial. The soil had been moved, compacted, and settled in ways that suggested repeated excavation and refilling over the course of several years. They did not excavate. The ethical implications were too complex, and the legal questions surrounding the disturbance of century-old graves made the process prohibitively difficult. But the discovery raised new questions about what had happened to James and Elizabeth after their father's death in 1891, after Thomas, Mary, and Sarah had been sent away to live with relatives who probably had no knowledge of the two younger siblings who should not have existed. Had someone buried something in that plot, creating a physical memorial for children who existed only in grief and photograph? Had the manifestations persisted after Robert Pritchard died, forcing the community to acknowledge their presence with a grave marker, even though there were no bodies to enter? Or had something else occurred, something that required the soil to be disturbed repeatedly, as if whatever lay beneath refused to remain at rest? The researchers published their findings in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 2015, concluding that the Harlan manifestations represented a case study in the intersection of collective psychology, environmental trauma, and phenomena that currently lack adequate explanatory frameworks. It was the most cautious possible way of saying, we found something we cannot explain. The photograph of the Pritchard children continued to circulate, appearing in documentaries about unexplained phenomena, in books about Appalachian folklore, in academic papers about the history of photography and the psychology of grief. Each new examination brought new observations but no closer understanding. The 5 children stared out from the image with their rehearsed smiles, frozen in a moment that should not have been possible, witnesses to their own impossible existence. In 2017, a filmmaker named Sarah Bennett decided to create a documentary about the photograph, traveling to archives across the eastern United States to gather every scrap of information available about the Pritchard family and the town of Harlan during the late 19th century. She interviewed descendants of families who had lived in Harlan during the 1880s, though most of them knew only fragments of stories passed down through generations, memories worn smooth by time until only the shape of strangeness remained. One of these descendants, a man named Robert Pritchard VI, claimed to be the great-great-grandson of Thomas Pritchard, the oldest child in the photograph. He had inherited a small wooden box containing family documents, letters, photographs, and a journal that had belonged to his ancestor. He had never examined the contents carefully, treating them as historical curiosities rather than anything of personal significance. When Bennett asked to see the materials, he agreed, curious about what connection they might have to the strange photograph that researchers kept asking about. The journal was small, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and fragile. Thomas Pritchard had begun writing in it in 1895, when he was 22 years old, living in Richmond, Virginia, working in a textile mill and trying to build a life far from the mountains that had consumed his childhood. Most of the entries were mundane, records of work schedules, expenses, brief notes about the weather or conversations with coworkers. But there was one entry, dated November 3, 1895, that Bennett read with growing unease. I dreamed of them again last night. James and Elizabeth standing at the foot of my bed, smiling the way they always smiled, as if they knew something I could never understand. They have not aged. They look exactly as they did in that photograph the man from Philadelphia took all those years ago. Mary says I should stop thinking about them, that they were never real, that Father's grief made us see things that did not exist. But I remember James teaching me how to skip stones in the creek. I remember Elizabeth braiding Sarah's hair. I remember their voices, their laughter, the weight of James's hand on my shoulder when I was afraid of the dark. Mary insists we only imagined them because Father needed us to. She says that when we left Harlan and went to live with Aunt Catherine, they disappeared because we no longer had to pretend. But that is not what happened. They came with us. I saw them in the window of Aunt Catherine's house on the first night we arrived. I saw them standing in the yard, watching us through the glass. And Aunt Catherine saw them too. She never said anything, but I know she did, because she started setting 2 extra places at the table, just like Father used to do. They followed us. Or perhaps we carried them with us. I do not know which is true, but I know they are still here, somewhere, waiting in the spaces between what we remember and what we are willing to acknowledge. Sometimes I think I should go back to Harlan, back to the place where they first appeared and see if they are still there, standing in the ruins of the cabin, smiling that strange smile. But I am afraid of what I might find. Or worse, afraid that I will find nothing at all, and that would mean admitting they were never real, that everything I remember is a lie constructed by a child's desperate need to make sense of a father's madness. I do not know which would be worse, discovering they were real or discovering they were not. The entry was the last one in the journal. Thomas Pritchard died in 1897 at the age of 24 from tuberculosis contracted during his years working in poorly ventilated textile mills. His sister Mary lived until 1943, dying in a nursing home in Virginia, never speaking about her childhood in Harlan except to say that she had been fortunate to escape. Sarah, the youngest, married a railroad worker and moved to Ohio, where she raised 4 children and died in 1951. None of her descendants reported any unusual experiences or manifestations. Bennett included Thomas's journal entry in her documentary, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2018 under the title The Children Who Were Not There. The film presented the photograph, the historical research, the scientific analysis, and the testimony of descendants, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions about what had happened in Harlan, Kentucky in the spring of 1887. The documentary was well received, winning awards for its careful balance between skepticism and openness to mystery. But it also generated controversy. Paranormal enthusiasts accused Bennett of being too cautious, of refusing to acknowledge the obvious supernatural implications of the evidence. Skeptics accused her of giving credence to folklore and delusion, of presenting a case that could be easily explained by photographic error and mass hysteria, as if it were genuinely mysterious. Bennett herself, in interviews following the film's release, maintained that she had no definitive answer to offer. "I set out to understand what happened to the Pritchard family," she said in an interview with Documentary Magazine in 2019. "What I discovered was that understanding might not be possible. Some events exist at the boundary of what we can explain, and maybe that boundary is where they are supposed to remain." The photograph, meanwhile, continued to exist in archives and databases, available for anyone to examine, a permanent record of 5 children who stood together in the spring of 1887, 3 of whom had been born and 2 of whom had no explanation for their presence except the desperate love of a father who refused to let grief have the final word. In 2020, during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, when millions of people were confined to their homes and turned to the internet for connection and distraction, the photograph of the Pritchard children experienced a resurgence of attention. It was shared on social media platforms, discussed in online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries, analyzed by amateur researchers who had time to examine historical records that had been recently digitized and made available to the public. One of these amateur researchers, a software engineer named Marcus Chen, became obsessed with the technical aspects of the photograph, convinced that modern image analysis technology might reveal something that previous researchers had missed. He downloaded the highest resolution scan available from the Kentucky Historical Society's database and subjected it to every form of digital analysis he could access. Edge detection algorithms, frequency domain analysis, machine learning-based object recognition, even experimental techniques designed to detect AI-generated images by identifying statistical anomalies in pixel distribution. What he found was not evidence of manipulation, but rather evidence of consistency. The photograph was internally coherent in ways that made it even more inexplicable. The lighting on each child's face, despite the inconsistent shadows, matched the ambient light levels that would have been present in Harlan, Kentucky, at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon in mid-May, based on solar angle calculations and historical weather records. The grain structure of the photographic emulsion was uniform across the entire image, showing no signs of composite layering or multiple exposures. Even the children's clothing, when examined at high magnification, showed wear patterns and fabric textures consistent with garments from the 1880s, with no evidence of painted or drawn additions. But there was one anomaly that Chen's analysis revealed, something that had not been visible in previous examinations. When he applied a technique called shadow vector analysis, which traced the direction and length of shadows to determine the position of light sources, he discovered that each child in the photograph appeared to be illuminated by a light source positioned at a slightly different angle and distance. It was as if 5 separate suns had been shining on the Pritchard children when Edmund Grayson pressed the shutter release on his camera. This finding was consistent with the observations made by previous researchers, but Chen's analysis quantified it in a way that made the impossibility undeniable. According to the laws of optics, the photograph could not exist, yet it did. Chen published his findings on a personal blog in July 2020, expecting little response. Instead, his analysis was read by thousands of people, shared across social media, and eventually came to the attention of Dr. Elena Vasquez, the MIT researcher who had examined the photograph in 2008. She reached out to Chen, and together they collaborated on a more comprehensive study, using resources from MIT's Media Lab to conduct the most thorough analysis of the photograph ever attempted. Their work, published in 2021 in the journal Computational Photography, Theory and Applications, concluded that the Pritchard photograph represented an image that records an event inconsistent with known physical laws. They did not attempt to explain how this was possible, only to document that it was. The publication attracted attention from physicists studying the nature of observation and reality, particularly those working in quantum mechanics, where the act of measurement is known to influence the state of particles in ways that defy classical understanding. Some researchers proposed that the photograph might be evidence of a macroscopic quantum phenomenon, a situation where the observer effect, usually confined to the subatomic scale, had somehow manifested at the level of visible reality. This theory suggested that Edmund Grayson, when he looked through his camera at the Pritchard family in May 1887, had not simply recorded what was there, but had participated in determining what was there. His act of observation collapsing multiple potential realities into a single captured moment that contained elements from several simultaneous states of being. It was a theory that strained credibility, requiring a leap from laboratory experiments with individual photons to a claim about 5 children standing in Appalachian sunlight. But it offered something that pure skepticism could not: a framework for understanding how the photograph might be both authentic and impossible, how James and Elizabeth Pritchard might be both real and unborn, how grief and longing might interact with the fundamental uncertainty of existence to create something that should not be but undeniably was. The photograph of the Pritchard children remains in the collection of the Kentucky Historical Society, cataloged, preserved, and available for study. The original glass plate negative is stored in climate-controlled conditions, handled only with archival gloves, protected against the deterioration that claims all physical objects eventually. But the image itself, reproduced countless times in digital format, has achieved a kind of immortality, circulating through academic papers, documentaries, websites, and social media posts, always accompanied by the same questions. Who were James and Elizabeth Pritchard? How did they appear in a photograph if they were never born? What does their presence tell us about the nature of reality, grief, and the power of human longing? There are no definitive answers. The historical record provides fragments: a father's grief, a community's silent accommodation, a physician's unease, a grave marker for children who left no other trace. The scientific analysis confirms the photograph's authenticity while deepening its mystery. The theories, psychological, physical, supernatural, offer frameworks for understanding but cannot fully explain. In 2023, the town of Harlan, Kentucky, still exists, though it bears little resemblance to the coal mining community of the 1880s. The population has dwindled to fewer than 150 residents. The mines are sealed. The company housing has collapsed or been demolished. The forests have reclaimed most of the valley, leaving only scattered remnants of the industrial infrastructure that once defined the landscape. But the cemetery where James and Elizabeth Pritchard's grave marker stands has been maintained by local volunteers who recognize its historical significance. The marker has been cleaned, the surrounding vegetation cleared, and a small plaque installed explaining the story for visitors who make the journey to this remote corner of Appalachia. The plaque reads, "In memory of James and Elizabeth Pritchard, children who existed at the boundary between love and loss, whose presence in a single photograph from 1887 continues to challenge our understanding of what is possible." Whether they were manifestations of grief, witnesses to a reality we have yet to comprehend, or simply children whose existence was not recorded in the ways we expect, their story reminds us that the human heart can create what the mind cannot fully explain. Visitors to the site often leave small tokens, photographs of their own families, letters to loved ones who have passed, flowers that wilt and are replaced by others. The grave has become a pilgrimage site for people who have experienced profound loss, who find in the mystery of the Pritchard children a validation of their own grief, a suggestion that love might persist beyond the boundaries that death imposes. Sarah Bennett, the filmmaker who documented the story in 2018, returned to Harlan in 2024 to create a follow-up short film about how the photograph's legacy has evolved in the digital age. She interviewed visitors to the cemetery, researchers who continue to study the image, and descendants of Harlan's original residents who carry fragments of the story in their family memories. One of these descendants, a woman named Margaret Stiles, whose great-grandmother had been a friend of Alice Munro, the woman who heard 5 children's laughter coming from the Pritchard cabin, shared a story that had been passed down through 4 generations. My great-grandmother used to say that Harlan was a place where the walls between worlds were thin, worn down by sorrow until you could see through to the other side. She said the mountains held grief the way they held coal, compressed under pressure until it became something solid and permanent. And she said that sometimes, when the grief was strong enough and the love was desperate enough, what was wished for could become real enough to touch, real enough to photograph, real enough to leave a mark that would last longer than the people who created it. She never spoke about the Pritchard children directly, but she told me once near the end of her life that she had seen them herself, years after Robert Pritchard died, years after the cabin burned down. She saw them standing on the road that led out of town, looking back toward where their home had been, not moving, just standing there as if they were waiting for someone to come back for them. She said she walked right past them, and they turned to look at her, and she saw in their eyes something that made her understand that they knew they were not supposed to be there, that they existed only because someone had loved them so much that reality had to make room for them, even if just for a little while. And then she blinked, and they were gone, and she never saw them again. But she never forgot them either. None of us have. Bennett's follow-up film, titled Still Waiting: The Pritchard Children in Memory and Time, premiered online in October 2024, reaching an audience far larger than her original documentary. The film ends with the photograph itself, displayed in full resolution, the 5 children staring out at viewers with their enigmatic smiles, their inconsistent shadows, their impossible presence. The final words of the film are spoken by Bennett herself, in voiceover. We may never know what Edmund Grayson captured when he pressed the shutter release on his camera in Harlan, Kentucky, in May 1887. We may never understand how James and Elizabeth Pritchard could stand with their siblings despite having no birth records, no official existence, no explanation for their presence except the desperate love of a father who refused to accept loss. But perhaps the mystery itself is the point. Perhaps some stories exist not to be solved, but to remind us that reality is more complex, more responsive to human emotion, more permeable to longing than our rational minds want to admit. The Pritchard children, whether they were real in the way we understand reality, or real in some other way we have yet to comprehend, stand as witnesses to the power of grief and love to reshape the world, to force existence itself to acknowledge what the heart refuses to forget. And they are still there, in that photograph, waiting for us to look at them and wonder, waiting for us to ask the questions that have no easy answers, waiting perhaps for us to love someone so deeply that we understand, finally, how they came to be. The photograph remains available for examination, its mysteries intact, its questions unanswered, its 5 children frozen in a moment that defies explanation but demands to be remembered. Records confirm it was taken on May 14, 1887. Science confirms it has not been altered or manipulated. History confirms that James and Elizabeth Pritchard should not have been able to stand there, smiling at the camera alongside their siblings. Yet there they are, and there they will remain, permanent witnesses to something we cannot fully explain but cannot deny, evidence that the boundary between what is and what is wished for might be thinner than we imagine, that grief and love might have power beyond what we understand, that reality itself might be more accommodating to human longing than the laws of nature seem to allow. What happened in Harlan, Kentucky, in the 1880s? What did Robert Pritchard's desperate love create? What did Edmund Grayson's camera capture? We may never know, but the photograph endures, asking its questions, preserving its mystery, reminding us that some truths exist at the edges of comprehension, where the known world meets the wished-for world, and where sometimes the two become indistinguishable. If you've made it this far, it's because this story moved something in you. Leave a comment saying, "I've watched this far," so I can get to know you and see who really connects with these forgotten histories. Subscribe to this channel to preserve the stories that history tried to bury, because some truths are too important to forget. Share this video with someone who appreciates mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about reality. The Pritchard children are still waiting, still watching, still asking us to remember that love, in its most desperate form, might be powerful enough to rewrite the laws that govern existence itself.